Kavvak sat on the stone bench, enjoying the midday sun on his hide. Hot days like this helped him feel just a little younger than his 100 cycles. He looked up at the statue that never failed to move him. He remembers the day it was erected, 60 cycles ago. The excited chattering of the next class drifted down the hall to him. This was his favorite part of the history class he taught. To most, it was just history, something that happened before their time. But to him, it was still alive in both his hearts.
"Come in and take a seat, hatchlings."
Raising his voice to be heard over the noise 30 hatchlings could make. Kavvak sometimes got irritated by how difficult it could be to quiet 30 students who were barely 10 cycles old. But then he remembered his childhood and how difficult it was. He preferred the happy chatter of the hatchlings over the fear and hopelessness when he was their age.
"Quiet down, hatchlings."
Looking sternly at them.
So for today's lesson I brought you to one of our people's most sacred monuments.
He began to stroll to the statue before pointing at it.
Who can tell me what this statue depicts? Kurnach?
Picking a student from the back row. Kortnak stood.
It's a human, honored elder.
Govak nodded in approval.
Very good, Kurnach. You may be seated. And who can tell me about the humans?
His arms clasped behind his back as he turned to look at them.
Rujdok?
Rujdok rose and confidently stated,
They are aliens, but my sire calls them just a myth, a legend.
Govak looked out at the other students.
How many of you agree that humans are a myth?
Almost every claw shot up. Kavovak shook his head and thought to himself,
Less than 90 cycles for real events to become a myth. That is incorrect, Rujdok. Your sire is quite wrong.
Turning to look up with reverence.
I was there when the humans appeared to us, saved us.
An excited buzz coursed through the class. Several students asked questions at the same time.
Really? Were humans as tall as the statue? Where are they now? Did you meet any?
Govak held up a claw to quiet them.
Yes, I was there when the humans came.
He took a moment to gather his thoughts.
I wasn't much older than you are now when we still lived on Korthan.
Another excited buzz at the mention of their former homeworld. The young grew up on tales of life before they had to leave the planet. To the young, it was so long ago that they forgot some Kexians were still alive from that time. Kovak stood in front of them.
There was no Kexian Republic then, and we'd only recently left our world for the stars. We'd established a few colonies on our moons, but couldn't even explore our entire system yet. My sire was a member of the ruling council of elders.
Kovak still felt proud of his sire.
We sent messages to the stars, wondering if we were alone. We made first contact with the Kumarians, and from them, we learned of many other races. Small groups of aliens came to trade and welcome us to the galactic community, one of which was the humans. Unlike most aliens, they were fair in their dealings with us. It was one of their laws when it came to interacting with those races new to the stars.
Kovak continued.
We traded for new technology, including new tools to examine our system and to explore our world. It was one of these new devices that warned us of the danger building inside our second moon, Pataxark.
As always, a rush of memories came to Kovak when he taught this lesson.
What was the danger?
One of the students exclaimed. Kovak hid a smile as he replied.
I will tell you in a moment. Be patient. Pressure was building to an extremely high level, and there was concern it would endanger our science outpost there.
Kovak took a breath.
We didn't think big enough that it would crack our moon and send chunks of it to our home world. At first, our scientists just studied the changes, but things changed once they saw the fault lines beginning to widen, and then the moonquakes became more frequent, more intense. They sent messages to scientists of various races, and they warned us it was just a matter of subcycles before it cracked wide open. And then they told us it would most likely destroy our planet when the huge chunks hit the surface. Our other moon couldn't sustain life. It was just another outpost.
Kovvak said. Kovvak remembered the looks on the faces of the adults, the hushed whispers and discussions about what to do.
We were still new to space and had very few ships capable of leaving our system. We needed help if we were to survive. Messages were sent to all the races we'd met.
He still remembered his sire's anger.
But they either ignored us or offered to sell, rent their ships for an exorbitant amount. A few offered us shelter, but in return we'd be like slaves for them.
Kovvak still loathed the Kisinit for that so-called offer.
We'd just about given up on help from other races and made plans to get as many out as possible.
Kovvak enjoyed how engrossed the students were in his tall.
We had no idea that someone answered our call, but the humans did. A massive fleet arrived, thousands of ships of all sizes, warships, transports, luxury liners, cargo haulers, and shuttles by the hundreds to move us from the planet to the ships. The humans apologized for taking so long to get there. My sire calculated how long it took to travel from Querthen to the humans' home system. They'd left less than a rotation after they got our message.
Looking at his students' faces, he remembered having that same look of astonishment. Kovvak continued.
And now humans were known to be efficient, but the level of their preparation was beyond belief. They knew just how many of our people could fit per ship, with our most necessary possessions. Teams of humans worked with our people to dismantle our most important buildings. Temples, factories, space launching facilities, monuments, schools, and others were just torn down for the material. Samples of native flora and as much fauna as they could safely catch were taken aboard explorer ships set up to do just that. Surprisingly, they managed to get samples of almost all flora and large numbers of wild fauna. All the wild animals you see in the parks and wild are from our home planet.
It still left Kovvak in awe at just how much they did in such a short time.
They'd even completely evacuated and removed our outposts on both moons, and extracted large amounts of our resources for our use in rebuilding.
Kovvak smiled as he teased the students.
Remember that when you complain, it takes too long to clean your dens.
Kovvak carried on with the tale.
They did this without stopping for 10 rotations. They took us to a planet they'd been terraforming for their use, but hadn't occupied yet. We got another surprise when we landed and found another large group of humans had been putting up temporary shelters for us. Holes have been dug to transfer the water from our planet, to save on the time it can take to have enough for all of us and our animals. Until the moisture processors can supply enough to create all the lakes and some of the rivers you see now. With this world being much closer to Querthen, they were able to make multiple trips back and forth. All of our people, except the ones that stayed to help, were transferred here in less than 8 rotations on Querthen. That would be 6 rotations here. My sire was one of the volunteers and told me they worked until almost the last minute before it happened.
Kovvak vividly remembers the sorrow in his sire's voice as he described the death of our world.
I was with my sire when the Council of Elders met with the humans that had been in charge of the evacuation.
Kovvak continued.
The elders asked how they should repay the humans for their help, and one of them made a joke.
He said,
It was traditional to repay someone with pizza and beer when they help you move. We were confused, but all the humans laughed at that.
Kovvak followed up by explaining it was a joke.
They asked for nothing but our friendship, and to not be like the races that refused or tried to take advantage of us. Humans stayed 2 cycles to help us get our civilization in order again. Cities were built, flora planted, and then wild fauna released. They even helped us establish and build a fleet of our ships. Not just military, but civilian and exploration vessels. Our warships are only slightly modified from the designs the humans gave us.
Kovvak finished with,
Humans are real, and we owe them a great debt.
The students began talking excitingly about the lessons before one student raised a claw.
Yes, Haytalk?
Kavvak was sure what the question would be. They always asked eventually.
Honored Elder, if the humans are real, then why haven't we seen them?
Haytalk queried.
They were betrayed.
Kavvak stated simply. Many of his students gave an audible gasp at this statement. Several students spoke out with questions that all amounted to the same thing: who betrayed them and how.
That will be fully explained at a later date, but to summarize.
Kavvak took a sip from the container of water, where he kept it on his belt.
29 cycles after we arrived on this world, a new race entered our galaxy. They were almost as malevolent as they were powerful, and they announced their arrival by destroying 8 colonies from various races.
Kavvak said.
The only reply they gave to calls sent to them was simply, "Submit or die." But that was a lie.
Kavvak took another sip. He always needed fluids by the end of the lessons, from all the talking. He continued.
A Berithian colony surrendered to them, and they still destroyed it. They enslaved some of the people, but they exterminated others in horrific manners. An object lesson, they said. The humans were furious. The Berithians were a peaceful people and not very numerous.
Kavvak said.
I asked one why they reacted that way, and he replied, "We don't like bullies, especially when they target our friends. So the humans called for war against the new race. We didn't even know their name."
Kavvak shook his head in disgust.
The Great Council argued over it. Some assumed they would only attack the lesser races and leave them alone. Others wanted to keep trying the diplomatic route. Others agreed, but would only protect their space. Ourselves and over a half-dozen smaller races answered the humans' call, but we could only muster 60 real warships between us. Where the human ambassador had raged at the more powerful races, he warmly welcomed us to join the effort. The only one of the most powerful races, the Kithranka, promised support, but being on the other side of the galaxy, it would take some time to get a fleet to human space. It was at this point that the human ambassador shamed the rest of the council by saying they didn't need them, they'd just be in the way, and promptly exited the chambers with us joining him.
Kavvak kept on with the story.
The Kithranka ambassador barely said anything before he nodded at us and left to contact his govt. The human ambassador thanked us for being loyal friends and got us in contact with their fleet command.
Another student raised a claw.
Then what? Did we fight?
Kavvak proudly replied.
Yes, we did. I was serving on one of our cruisers and made sure I got to go help our friends. The humans only requested 5 ships from each of us. They didn't want us defenseless. So we joined with the humans' armada. It was far larger than the one that saved us, and it was all warships. I was told there were over 100,000 ships of various sizes, from massive carriers to small starfighters. But the enemy brought more and bigger ships.
Images of the chaos of battle filled Kavvak's head before he continued.
The humans had us in reserve to counter their flank attack. I'd never even heard of a battle this massive, let alone seen.
Kavvak's heart began beating faster as he remembered the terror and exhilaration of the fight.
The humans drove straight into the center of the enemy's formation. It was so chaotic that it was almost impossible to tell friend from foe.
Another student spoke up.
But what about you and our ships?
Kavvak continued.
We did as asked and attacked any ships that got around the flanks, mostly fighters and destroyers, but we did have to gang up on a large cruiser too. And after 3/4 of a rotation, the battle was over.
Kavvak looked at each student.
Only a few of the enemy escaped and none of their capital ships. But the humans paid a very heavy price for victory. 80% of their fleet was destroyed, and the rest heavily damaged. All but a dozen capital ships were floating wrecks. Our little squad only lost 3 ships destroyed, with the rest damaged in one way or the other. The human casualties were in the millions, dead, wounded, or missing.
Kvvak looked at the scars on his right arm from an exploding console after a massive hit.
And the next 2 rotations were spent rescuing survivors from wrecks and sending wounded to hospitals all over their space, including our wounded. Unlike other races, the humans didn't differentiate in treating their wounded and their allies.
Kvvak continued.
Aside from the Zathreks, we went to the same hospitals as their wounded. The Zathreks could only go on a special hospital ship that would take them home, since their biology made it difficult to treat in a standard human med facility. But the humans treated them as a priority to get home. A small Kithranka fleet arrived a rotation after the battle. Only 25 smaller ships that had been on convoy duty were much closer than the home fleets. They were sent ahead of the others.
Is that how they were betrayed, that the others didn't show up?
A student named Polenka asked.
No, the enemy did not take their defeat lightly, and they launched antimatter torpedoes into the stars of systems inhabited by human colonies. Even the humans' home system was targeted, and their cradle world was destroyed.
Kvvak replied, unable to keep the sadness from his voice.
The betrayal came from one of the races on the council, either scared of the enemy or angry at the humans that relayed the location of all the humans' major colonies.
Another student, Zenigis, asked.
Who did that?
Kvvak answered.
We don't know. But since the location of one of the destroyed human military bases was known only to less than a dozen races, someone gave it up.
So that killed all the humans?
Kvvak didn't see which student asked.
No. Less than 1 million humans survived on a few minor colonies and stations.
Kvvak continued.
They spent the next 10 cycles rebuilding their military and constructing 5 massive motherships. The humans wanted revenge, and they were going to find the enemy's space and finish what they started.
Kvvak took another sip.
And so all but a few humans left this galaxy to take war to the enemy. The ones that stayed all died eventually. So we built this statue to remember them and their friendship with us.
Kvvak finished.
And now, my inquisitive little hatchlings, the lesson is over and it's time to go home.
It was just days after the destruction of Earth and her many colonies and outposts. The cataclysm, as it became known, had nearly extinguished humanity's spark from the universe. Billions and billions died, but some survived, less than 1 million souls, grieving the loss of their friends, their families, their homes, their species, and Earth. Billions of years of the evolution of life were destroyed in hours. 99% of Earth's flora and fauna were gone forever. Even those seated on the colony worlds were exterminated. So the call went out, and the last vestiges of humanity gathered on one of the few worlds to escape destruction. Only escaping destruction because it was in the last stages of terraforming. Expeditions were sent to retrieve pieces of Earth and the other destroyed colonies, a memorial for the dead and a promise of revenge. The survivors came and held ceremonies for all they lost, and then they swore revenge. They swore to track down the enemy and teach them their mistake, the mistake of not completely exterminating humanity. They left some alive and filled them with a terrible thirst for revenge, one that could only be sated by the extermination of the enemy. The enemy left more than 150,000 wrecks after their defeat. It took years to gather it all, examine it, and disassemble ships for study. Never before had humans been so focused on the task. They salvaged everything from the battlefield, Terran, and alien. All but a few of mankind's remaining outposts were dismantled. The broken remnants of both fleets were scrapped and used in the construction of the 5 massive motherships and in rebuilding the human navy. It was a tremendous undertaking to construct the biggest starships in this galaxy. Examining, deciphering, and reverse engineering the enemy's tech had advanced humanity's technical knowledge, by leaps and bounds. Examining the enemy bodies revealed them to be genetically engineered clones. They averaged 2 meters in height and 135 kilos in weight with 4 arms, 2 of which ended in hands of 4 fingers and 2 thumbs. The other ended in a nasty set of claws. Their 4 eyes were set above a muzzle that held an impressive number of sharp fangs. Auditory openings were located on the neck and the olfactory were under the jaw. Their cranium was thick with a small crest down the middle. They were bipedal with legs that bent backward like a horse. Their feet ended in 6 toes, with talons that were curved in such a way as to rip the target's flesh off when kicked. Their body was covered in multiple plates of a black, chitinous form of armor. The navigational data gave them descriptions of tens of thousands of stars and millions of planets, moons, and other astral phenomenon. It allowed them to locate the wormhole that connected the Milky Way to the Andromeda Galaxy. It showed the locations of several more. But the most coveted information had not been found yet. The location of the enemy's home or their name, so the humans just called them the Wraith. The name was taken from a fictional evil alien race in a 21st century TV show. The information gleaned from their ships and equipment allowed the humans to completely revamp their starship design. New pilot neural interfaces allowed smaller crews per ship. The reduction in crew space left more room for armor, weapons, or sensors. Humanity's centuries of fascination with the sci-fi genre was invaluable. It inspired new ideas to explore the limits of what they knew. The limited numbers of humans meant not only did quality need to outweigh quantity, but everything created needed to maximize the potential of individual humans. Books, short stories, games, movies, TV shows, and even animation inspired new ideas. Not all were useful. Transporters were not possible with current tech, but power armor, mechs, weapons, and 100's other ideas. Destroyers now needed just a single pilot, cruisers 3, and capital ships 24. Only the carriers had a large crew, but where it had needed thousands, it took hundreds. The combining of human and Wraith technology allowed for ships faster, tougher, and far more deadly than what the Wraith encountered in the Milky Way. For 10 long years, humans worked tirelessly mining materials for their great ships. Food was grown and preserved in millions of tons, until finally they were ready. The Revenge, the Vengeance, the Reckoning, the Retribution, and the Avenger were fit for launch. 10-kilometer long, 6-kilometer wide, and 3-kilometer tall. Each ship could hold 10 times the number of humans still alive, from a race that numbered in the tens of billions to now just over 1 million men, women, and children. Giant facilities turned out the weapons humanity needed, from small arms to mechs to warships. Docking ports allowed the capital ships to ride the motherships, like remoras to a massive shark. Massive hangars held fighters, destroyers, and cruisers. In a matter of moments, a fleet of 5 could become a fleet of 5,000. Thousands of weapon systems dotted the hulls, from standard rail guns and missile batteries to massive plasma cannons that could devastate a planet, and everything in between. It was then that humanity left the galaxy of their birth and began the Great Hunt. From this moment on, there were only 2 options left: victory or death. Aboard his flagship, Revenge, Admiral Tanaka stood over the tech's shoulder as the fleet entered a new system. It was his ritual to look and to think, let this be the one. For 30 long years, the humans prowled the stars in search of their prey, and for 30 long years, they'd only found signs of their activities, but not them. Dead worlds, planets split into hundreds of floating rocks, or the remains of extinct civilizations. They'd stop and explore the last, looking for signs of their foe. 6 months here, a year there, gathering resources needed for the journey, never forgetting their oath given to their dead. Humanity had thrived during the journey, There were over 5 million of them now. One of the technologies they discovered and improved upon was cold sleep. This let humanity conserve resources during the trip and keep their forces at prime readiness. Only 1/4 were out of cold sleep for a year. Pregnant women and children under 15 were excluded. The Admiral turned to look at asked,
Captain Isle, status of the fleet?
Captain Isle double-checked his console before replying,
All present and accounted for.
Thank you, Captain. Deploy recon units and assume defensive formation.
The Admiral acknowledged. The bridge crew worked with the efficiency their search had provided. Basic data rolled in immediately, number of planets and moons, other celestial bodies present, and distances from the flagship's current position. So when an excited voice called for the Admiral's attention, everyone focused on her.
Admiral, Recon 7 reports enemy contact at the 4th moon of the 5th planet.
Admiral Tanaka externally kept up a calm demeanor, but inside he was shouting with joy.
Finally, you bastards. Focus, Ensign, and remember your training.
The Admiral reminded her.
I need more info.
The ensign looked abashed, but continued to relay incoming info.
Yes, sir. Sorry, sir.
Her voice steadied.
Recon 7 states an enemy fleet of approximately 120 ships. They are continuing to gather intel on types and more exact numbers. Long-range sensors also detect a large debris field in the area of the fleet. Recon 7 says there appears to be weapons fire directed at the planet.
She finished. The Admiral gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze to let her know how well she'd done.
Thank you, Ensign.
When the Admiral turned to face Captain Isle, the look they gave each other conveyed their agreement.
Captain, inform the fleet of the situation. Do you concur we have sufficient force currently available to engage the enemy?
Yes, Admiral.
Before continuing,
As long as there aren't any more in the system or reinforcements join them.
Admiral Tanaka thought for a moment before answering.
Begin revival procedures. Non-combatants transferred to the Avenger and Retribution.
He then turned to one of the communication techs.
Switch to the fleet-wide channel, if you please.
This channel allowed the Admiral to directly address every ship in the fleet and over the mothership's internal comm systems. When the tech gave a nod, the Admiral spoke into the handset.
Attention the fleet. We've found an enemy force and our revenge starts today. We've spent decades working to this moment and we are ready.
Admiral Tanaka had waited decades to say this.
Battle stations, let's fuck 'em up.
Captain Isle looked at the Admiral with a raised eyebrow, to which the Admiral responded with a boyish grin and a laugh.
What? I couldn't think of anything else.
The bridge crew laughed before turning to their stations and starting the process of bringing the fleet to full combat readiness. Returning to seriousness, he spoke to the bridge crew.
I want all the Avenger and Retribution, and their ships to hang back in reserve. The Vengeance and Reckoning to join us in engaging the enemy fleet.
Admiral Tanaka continued.
I want all ships crewed and ready for the launch the second we land behind the enemy.
Klaxons sounded throughout the massive ships, joined by the sounds of boots pounding on metal as crews ran to their stations. Shuttles ferried the non-combatants to the Avenger and Retribution, while the process of awakening the personnel in cryo-sleep began. It seemed like forever, but in less than 15 minutes the fleet was ready for combat. Captain Isle confirmed this.
Admiral, fleet signals readiness. Non-combatants have been transferred, all ships and guns are manned, and defensive measures are at maximum efficiency.
Very good, Captain. Let it begin.
Captain Isle turned and gave the long-awaited order.
Signal the fleet to jump.
The quick burst of FTL put them in range of the enemy between one heartbeat and the next. The Admiral glanced at the tactical officer, who replied with a nod that all 3 ships had hit the mark.
Launch all ships. Revenge, Vengeance, and Reckoning are to engage their capital ships, dreadnoughts, and carriers to assist. All other ships engage the sub-capital ships.
The Admiral gave a predatory grin before giving the long-awaited order.
All batteries open fire.
Untold numbers of Wraith died before they even knew what happened. The sheer power of the opening volley turned dozens of ships into floating wrecks, while others ceased to exist entirely. Decades of righteous fury were unleashed upon humanity's most hated foe. What happened next wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. While humanity's tech level had advanced at a rapid pace, the enemy's had not. Terran weapons tore through armor and shields with minimal trouble, but Wraith return fire caused limited damage. It took less than 10 minutes to completely obliterate every Wraith vessel. The bridge crew gave a huge cheer before a tech interrupted.
Admiral, weapons fire detected on the moon's surface. Wraith have landed troops and are engaging the locals.
Admiral Tanaka gave back a nod.
Thank you. Relay all relevant intel to General Garcia.
The Admiral contacted the General.
Did you catch all that, General?
General Garcia replied,
Yes, Admiral. Intel coming in now.
Excellent. You may drop when ready,
said the Admiral before following up with,
Good luck, Juan. Kick their ass and take no prisoners.
The General had a huge grin as he answered,
With pleasure.
It took only moments for the landing ships to launch and streak towards the surface.
Communications broadcast on all frequencies. We are here to assist against the enemy.
And then the Admiral looked at another officer.
Check our database for any info on the locals, especially language.
General Garcia and his troopers had a rough ride to the surface, but they wouldn't have missed it for the world. At 2 kilometers, designated ships began to launch 150 drop troops in power armor. They had limited flight capabilities, enough to get them down safely and maneuver easier on the ground. Firing on the way down, they hit the LZ and began securing it for the landing ships. Alerted by the loss of their fleet, the Wraith sent a force to engage the unknown attackers. They didn't send enough. 1,000 Wraith walked into a buzzsaw. They went down before they could even contact their commanders. A few humans walked among the carnage and administered the coup de grace to those still breathing. While that was being done, the landing ships disgorged massive mechs, armor, and ground pounders in augmented body armor. Scouts were sent out in a 360-degree circle to examine the enemy forces. General Garcia checked his watch. Ready reaction force on the ground and ready for action in 20 minutes. Not bad. The General keyed his chin mic.
All units, I want weapons and armor checks done. You got 10 minutes.
He looked over at his mechs and armored vehicles.
When checks are finished, mount up and prepare to move out.
10,000 human fighters prepared to start their campaign of revenge. His scouts began feeding him intel of destroyed villages, dead civilians, and soldiers with only a few dead Wraith. The locals were heavily outmatched by the enemy. Then the scouts were sent towards the large settlement they'd seen as they landed, and reported a large enemy force was engaged with the locals, and the locals were about to be overrun. He beckoned over a nearby officer before speaking.
Toby, load up your troops and drop between the enemy and the locals. Buy us some time to engage their rear.
Captain Asim saluted and ordered his power armor to load onto their dropships and be ready to drop. Group leader Hamelak peered over the lip of the trench, watching the Pachial advancing on his position. They didn't know their names, so his people just called them. Doom from above. Hopelessness was beginning to overwhelm the last of his surviving troops. But they could not run and leave all the civilians to the tender mercy of the enemy. So they stood their ground, exchanging fire in a futile attempt to keep them from the settlement behind them. Every moment they held the enemy back, bought with blood and death, was another for civilians to reach the vast warren of underground tunnels and bunkers. One of his soldiers exclaimed,
"Group leader!"
before pointing to the sky. Hamelak looked at the spacecraft flying in his direction. His shoulders slumped as he saw his impending doom flying in his direction. So imagine his surprise when the ships turned and flew parallel to his trench line. They shot fire into the mass of Pachial while some sort of bipedal being dropped from the ship and landed on thrusters of fire. He saw it was some sort of armor, but of a type he'd never heard of. black, with 4 appendages, 2 legs, and 2 arms. It had some sort of rifle in its hands and that pack that let it drop safely to the ground. The helmet completely covered what he assumed was the head. The mysterious aliens turned and engaged the enemy. One of them turned towards him and pointed to itself, and then its weapon, and then the enemy. It then pointed at him, and then to the settlement. It took a moment for Hamilak to understand, but then figured it out. He spoke into his communicator.
All units fall back to the village and regroup. The alien units will cover our retreat.
Hamilak and his soldiers grabbed their wounded, climbed out of the trench, and ran for the village as fast as their 4 legs could go. They took cover in the buildings that gave the best protection without sacrificing their line of fire. General Garcia watched the feed from the helmet cams of several of his troops in power armor. He estimated at least 40,000 Wraith, arrayed in formations of around 10K each. Only one formation was attacking the settlement and was now being engaged by his troopers. Snipers and scouts effectively eliminated all of the Wraith sentries they could locate. It was a complete surprise when they attacked the rear of the enemy formation. Railguns, autocannons, missiles, plasma, and metal projectiles in the thousands tore into the unprepared ranks of the hated foe. Mechs and some armored units remained to hold the rear, while his infantry and the rest of the armored units began to flank the Wraith on both sides. As reports came back, General Garcia thought to himself, "Got my own canny in the making. Maybe I'll have them call me Hannibal from now on." Just like in space, the Wraith were unprepared for the new human technology. The human losses were minimal, and most of those were just wounded. Once he got word, both sides had met up with the power armor units. He gave the order.
Advance and no mercy.
From his new position, Group Leader Hamilak watched as the new aliens charged into the horde of Pachial. They fought with a fury unlike anything he'd ever seen. The armored soldiers weren't content to just shoot at the enemy, but they charged into the middle of them, firing their weapons, slashing with some sort of blades that extended from the forearms, or just punching, kicking, and stomping on the Pachial. And before long, none of the Pachial were still standing. Some aliens were walking through the carnage and finishing the surviving Pachial. A pair of aliens walked up to Hamilak, and by how others responded, it must be the leader. The pair removed their helmets and looked at Hamilak before saying something in their language. He couldn't understand their words, but studied them curiously. They had 2 eyes, 2 ears, a mouth, what he guessed was a nose, and a small bit of fur on the top of their head. Their flesh was 2 different colors. He was inspecting their armor when his superiors arrived and gladly let them take over this first contact. The first shots of humanity's war of retribution had been fired. The first victory was won, and the first new allies were found. Many more of both would happen before the resolution of the humans' promises to their dead were honored. But those tales are for another time. Sergeant T.J. Wyatt was asleep when the klaxon sounded. He was barely awake as his body went through the well-drilled actions of getting into uniform and out the door. He swore under his breath at being woken up before his shift. But like all the men and women in the fleet, he beat feet down the corridors to his battle station. He wasn't sure what it was, but something felt different about this alarm. This wasn't a drill. Fortunately, he didn't have to run too far to the armory. He took his place in the formation with the rest of the Tats, Templar armored troopers, and waited for orders. A low buzz ran through the formation when General Garcia entered the armory.
"Attention, officer on deck,"
called out an unseen officer. An audible sound of boots moving on the floor and heels clicking echoed off the metal walls as several hundred crewmen came to attention.
"Morning, troopers."
The general's booming voice filled the air.
"Morning, sir,"
rang out from the assembled troops.
"I guess you are all wondering why I called you here this morning."
The troops gave a small chuckle as the general paused before continuing.
I've got some good news and some bad news for you all.
He paused before continuing.
We've spotted a Wraith fleet.
He just smiled while he waited for the cheers to subside.
They appear to be attacking a planet from orbit and on the ground.
A collective groan rose from the ranks.
Then what's the bad news?
The general grinned at that.
We gotta wait for the Navy to clear the way before we can drop.
A collective groan rose from the ranks. A noise came from the hatch as several crewmen came in with food and drink carts.
It's not breakfast in bed, but we don't have the time to hit the mess for chow. It's gonna be a long day, so get some chow and prepare to drop.
The general turned to go before looking back.
I almost forgot. Admiral Tanaka's orders are to kick ass and take no prisoners.
He returned the trooper's salute before leaving the armory. An officer called out,
"Dismissed."
And the armory became a flurry of activity. The sound of excited voices rang in the air. Sergeant Wyatt said to himself,
"About fucking time."
He'd been 12 years old when the Wraith destroyed the Sol system. His entire family died there, except him and his grandparents. They were terraformers, and he was spending 3 months with them while school was on break. He wanted to be a terraformer, like them, so his parents and grandparents thought it was a good idea for him to see what it was like before picking that path. It was early in the terraforming process, so there wasn't much to draw the Wraith's attention. He stopped wanting to be a terraformer that day. He volunteered for the new military academy at 15. He graduated and trained on the first generation of power armor. He was 22 when the fleet left on its mission of revenge. It was always odd to realize he was 52 chronologically, but with 2 cycles of cryo-sleep, he was physically closer to 30. Sergeant Wyatt began inspecting his suit, making sure it was combat-ready. He assisted the armorer with loading the auto-cannons, checking each round as they did. It was his ass if a bad round jammed the gun, or worse, exploded in the barrel. He did the same with the mini-missiles in the shoulder pods. He'd have to wait to check the forearm blade. He needed to be inside to extend the blades. After watching the crew fill up his oxygen and fuel tanks, he went to suit up. He held up his identity tags, aka dog tags, and touched them to his lips. They were made from a lightweight alloy with his name, ID number, and blood type. All the usual things except the small plastic bubble with a tiny, dark object in it. It was a piece of material from the humans' destroyed homes. First-generation survivors had a piece of their former home worlds. Anyone born after received a piece from a mix of all remains. In his case, Sergeant Wyatt had a piece of the earth. Besides memories, it was all he had left as a reminder of the family lost at its destruction. He put on the jumpsuit with special sensors that allowed the pilot to operate the power armor like a second skin. As he stepped into the legs, a crew member double-checked his legs lined up correctly before adding the front piece and completely enclosing his legs. He felt the lining of the legs being expanded to encase his lower body. It provided both protection from rattling around in the armor and also connected sensors in his suit to the power armor. The same was done with the torso and then the arms. Last was the helmet lined with more sensors that allowed him to operate systems with a thought. Powering the armor up, the Kevlar and titanium polymer activated to bind the torso armor to the extremities in a tough but flexible seal. Sergeant Wyatt ran through the checklist of all the systems and movements, checked the targeting mechanism of the autocannon in his left arm, and a launch system check of the mini-missile pods in the shoulder. He extended the blade in his right arm to let a crewman check it. Once he got the thumbs up, he withdrew the blade and grabbed his plasma rifle. After double-checking his rifle, he stomped over to form up by his dropship. 150 Templar MK. 3 power armor troopers lined up in front of their dropships. They were in the most advanced power armor the humans had ever created. 3 meters tall hybrid alloy armor with black laser-resistant coating, advanced sensor package, and armed to the teeth. Sensors in the pilot's bodysuit and helmet allowed for superior control of movement and weapon control. HUD inside the helmet allowed the pilot to bring up limited radar, targeting systems for missiles, targeting sights for autocannons and rifles, ammo count, and advanced optics system that allowed visuals beyond normal eyesight. Limited flight jump capabilities were provided by thrusters in the back and feet. All thruster ports were covered when not in use to prevent damage. Frequent updates were given on the fleet action until the word came to load up. The TATs loaded into 5 dropships, 30 per ship, and they would proceed to the LZ and secure it for the rest of the ground forces. First in, last out was the unofficial motto of the Templar Armored Troopers. Their jump flight capability allowed them to enter and exit the battlefield without a dropship needing to land. After making sure his squad was aboard and secured in place, Sergeant Wyatt gave a quick nod to the platoon sergeant that they were ready. He then took his place next to the door. His squad was jumping first. The 5 dropships left their hangars and dove for the planet. SOP was to get the troops on the ground as fast as possible. The TAT pilots liked to mess with the rookie TATs by telling them landing safely was optional. TAT pilots were considered crazy by other pilots in the fleet, but you want them slightly crazy. Being the first ships into a planet's atmosphere also meant you were the only targets for a few moments. A gradual descent was not an option, and the troopers preferred them that way because they knew these men and women would fly into hell to get them out if shit went foobar. Aside from some post-battle debris burning up in the atmosphere, it was an uneventful descent. At 2 kilometers, the dropship leveled off, and the side door opened. At a signal from the pilot, the lieutenant gave the go-ahead. Sergeant Wyatt stood up and yelled to his squad.
"My squad up and ready."
Followed by all the troopers giving the traditional response.
"To step into the shit!"
After double-checking his readings, Sergeant Wyatt jumped out of the door, falling like a rock. Minor adjustments of thrusters kept him on course for the jump zone. Just before landing, the thrusters in his feet and pack fired, slowing his progress until he touched down safely. He looked up to track the rest of his squad. They were coming in for a textbook landing, except PFC. Randall, a.k.a. Stumbling Bear, was coming in hot as usual. Randall landed hard but upright. Sergeant Wyatt keyed his mic.
"At least you stayed on your feet this time, Stumbling Bear."
Randall took advantage of his longtime friendship to return the one-finger salute. This just made the other troopers laugh harder. PFC Randall was given the nickname by CPL Yazzie after Randall made an especially hard landing, right on top of a slope, and then proceeded to roll down the hill. They quickly hustled to their position in the LZ's perimeter. Breaking his squad into 2 6-man fire teams, he sent CPL Yazzie with his team up a nearby hill, while his team dug in on the flats. Sergeant Wyatt made sure to tie in with the squads on his flanks and waited. As more dropships landed with troops and equipment, one of the pilots brought word of a group of Wraith inbound to the LZ. TATs were replaced by arriving units along the perimeter. The power armor was hidden 1 kilometer away in a small forest of what would be the Wraith's right flank. Available artillery was in place, along with other heavy weapons. The Wraith came into the TAT's view 5 minutes later. It was another 2 mins before the perimeter troops saw them. The Wraiths moved in what could only be described as a loose formation, more like a mob than a military unit. What happened next was a massacre. The Wraith were caught flat-footed as the perimeter troops opened fire. Artie began dropping in the middle of the pack and sent body parts flying. Moments later, the TAT came bounding into their right flank. Small, controlled bursts of their thrusters let them take much longer strides and arrive faster than normal running. They closed the trap on them, and the enemy didn't know what to do. It took less than 3 minutes to kill or injure every Wraith on the battlefield. The humans suffered 3 wounded and no dead. Sergeant Wyatt gathered his squad by the supply dump and reloaded their weapons. They'd just finished when their company commander, Captain Asim, ordered them back to the transport for another drop. After strapping in and lifting off, the platoon leader, Lieutenant Yannick, updated them on the situation. The lieutenant had to speak up to be heard over the engines.
Listen up. Recon boys spotted a large force of wraiths attacking a settlement.
The lieutenant continued.
Best guess is about 40,000, so more for us to kill.
He had to wait for the laughs to die down before following up.
The locals are taking a beating, so we'll be jumping between the wraith and the locals. We'll be holding the center with 2nd and 3rd platoon on our flanks. The rest of the force is gonna cornhole the bastards, and we'll crush them between us. Good luck, and I'll see you on the ground.
The lieutenant finished. It felt like forever, but was only a matter of minutes before Sergeant Wyatt and his team exited the dropship and were landing under fire. Sergeant Wyatt thought to himself, these guys are just as jumbled as the first group, like they don't understand tactics. His squad landed safely and immediately returned fire into the enemy mob. Sergeant Wyatt turned towards a local and pointed to himself, then his weapon, and then the enemy. He then pointed at the alien, and then to the settlement. Once he saw the alien understood him and started to retreat, he turned back to the fight. General Garcia's voice came over the comms.
Advance and no mercy.
Damn right no mercy, Sergeant Wyatt muttered to himself before opening the tack net for his squad.
Payback's a bitch. Charge.
All down the line, the Tats surged forward into the milling mass of the enemy. Nothing was held back. Plasma bolts, missiles, and autocannon slugs tore into the enemy ranks. Fist, foot, and elbow caved in Wraith's chest and head. Power-assisted arms allowed them to rip the limbs off the Wraith, and even beat them with it in one case. A message came over comms from the general.
We got them in the bag. They've got nowhere to run to.
It didn't seem possible, but the humans fought with even more fury. Hundreds of little combats erupted along the line. The Tats' power armor allowed them to charge into the fray and go hand in hand with the Wraiths. Sergeant Wyatt swung his spent rifle into a Wraith's face and hit with a satisfying crunch. He deployed the blade in his right arm and continued to rampage amongst the enemy. It didn't all go the Tats' way. Here and there, a trooper was pulled down and torn apart. Point-blank shots pierced the armor's weak spots. The infantry were also taking heavy casualties as the Wraith got in amongst them. But Sergeant Wyatt was oblivious to all of that. He should have been monitoring his squad, but he was lost in the frenzy of battle. All he could focus on was the need to avenge his family. Knocking a Wraith over, pinning him to the ground with a foot, and firing a blast into its face from the autocannon, driving his blade into the skull of another, stomping on the head of another Wraith on the ground, crushing it like a melon. When the autocannon was empty and the blade was broken, his fists pummeled the body and head, and kicks from his legs broke enemy leg bones and caved in torsos and heads. Lost in the frenzy, it was several moments before Sergeant Wyatt realized the noise of combat was dropping off. Soon there were no more Wraith near him, living that is. As the flow of adrenaline began to ebb, he realized just how tired he was. He looked around at the carnage and just how far it extended. Human medics and soldiers moved across the battlefield, removing the human wounded or finishing off any of the Wraith still alive. Sergeant Wyatt began to take stock of his squad's casualties. 3 of them were down and never getting up again, 2 seriously wounded, and 4 with minor wounds. Every surviving armor would need to be repaired in one form or another. His own was dented, clawed, and broken in dozens of places. The cost was high, with 762 dead and 1,900 wounded. But the first victory on the ground was achieved. Tactics and equipment performance would be examined, replacements would take over empty bunks, and damages would be repaired. The heroes would be decorated, and the dead would have their names engraved on the walls of honor. Sergeant Wyatt led what was left of his squad off the dropship and over to the power armor bays. The ground crew got him out of his armor, and he finally got a good view of the damage it suffered. It looked like hell, but had kept him safe. His heart was heavy when he saw the empty bays and thought of comrades lost. But he knew this wouldn't be the last time that he'd have to look at bays left empty by combat. Humanity's war of retribution had raged for 15 years since the first engagement over the Isset homeworld. 15 years of blood, tears, sacrifice, and death on an unimaginable scale. 15 years of meeting new races, making new allies, and strengthening those bonds on the battlefields of hundreds of planets and countless sections in the blackness of space. 15 years of driving the Wraith off numerous worlds and colonies. 15 years of liberating billions of lives from under the yoke of the Wraith. 15 years of scouring the galaxy for the race and eradicating any they found. And now the coalition formed during those 15 years stood on the Wraith's final bastion, the home system of their creators, the ones that created them to fight their wars and conquer new territories, only to see those same weapons turn on them and exterminate them. Only a handful escaped to tell the tale. The end of the war was finally in sight, but between that end and the mass of coalition forces were billions of Wraith in space, above and on the ground of a dozen worlds and moons. The only thing holding the humans back from treating their star, like they did solve, were the millions of slaves taken to toil for them. Many of the coalition advocated doing that anyway, but the losses they suffered both in Andromeda and the Milky Way just reinforced their belief in the value of the lives of other races. Humanity would fight alone if they must, but they would see those slaves free or they would be dead. Shamed by this and remembering what the humans suffered to free their world, they agreed. Billions of humans and her allies, 24 races, readied themselves for the final campaign. The Götterdämmerung to determine the fate of dozens of galaxies was about to begin. The humans' 5 massive motherships became the flagships for 5 fleets consisting of thousands of ships, big and small, and millions of ground troops. The coalition began the methodical process of destroying Wraith defenses, eliminating their presence on every moon and planet, giving millions of slaves their first taste of freedom in ages. Thousands of ships and millions of lives were lost in the drive to the Wraith homeworld, but for every ship lost or soldier fallen, a dozen Wraith joined them in death. Battles bigger than anything seen in even humanity's long history of warfare were mere skirmishes in this campaign. Until there was only one fight left, the only planet still held by the Wraith, the remnants of their once vast empire. Now fewer than 1 million ships and a few billion ground troops. Despite all their losses, they still outnumbered the array of ships fielded by the coalition and her ground troops. Time and time again, humanity's superior weapons, armor, and training overcame the Wraith's numbers. The thirst for revenge for all that had been done to the humans and their allies allowed them to overcome the Wraith's almost impassive attitude to warfare. But now, their back was against the wall. There was nowhere to run, and their enemy would not spare them. Would that make them fight that much harder? Aboard the human flagship Revenge, the leaders of the coalition militaries held their final briefing before the battle. Admiral Tanaka stood before a huge monitor, showing the plan of attack.
The Wraith had spread their fleet out and surrounded the planet.
Admiral Tanaka said, while pointing to the orbital map.
The Coalition War Council has elected to focus on less than one hemisphere.
Tanaka continued.
2nd Fleet would cover the eastern flank, 3rd the western, 4th the northern, and 5th the southern flanks.
Pointing to each one as he said them.
1st Fleet will punch a hole through the defenders and allow the transports to land troops.
Circling the fleet with the pointer.
And our Ottian friends,
nodding his head toward their admiral,
will deploy several small decoy fleets on the other side of the planet to keep those ships from reinforcing the others. They'll be using all those lovely tricks of theirs to confuse the Wraith sensors with just how many ships are there.
Tanaka followed up. Hiokian Admiral's predatory look showed just how eager he was to confound and embarrass that part of the Wraith fleet. It would be the greatest trick ever played in galactic history. Tanaka then pointed to a group of 3 males and a female sitting together before speaking.
Generals Garcia, Hammerlack, Zifiko, and Field Commander Kesatel.
Each nodding their head as their name was called.
Will lead the ground forces and hit these 4 targets.
Once again, using the pointer to identify them. Admiral Tanaka finished up.
It's been a long road, my friends, but it's time to finish it. Report to your forces and may fortune favor us.
Alarms sounded throughout the fleet. Aliens and humans ran to their battle stations. Batteries of missiles rose into place along the hulls of the flagships. Railguns, lasers, and plasma weapons were primed and fighters were launched. The Armada assumes formation and prepares to unleash a violent death on the Wraith. The transports fell behind the accelerating ships and waited for their chance to unleash their lethal cargo. Admiral Tanaka sent a message to the fleet with only one word.
Begin.
Humans Are a Myth, Part 3.1. This story is set in the final battle for the Wraith home world. Riding Trails of Fire. Lieutenant Yeram Tazi walked around her Black Widow starfighter, waiting for the balloon to go up. She ran a hand over its smooth surface. She looked for any flaws that might be fatal in space combat. On the other side, her crew chief did the same, and then they'd switch to double-check. She admired the sleek deadliness of the design. Just over 18 meters long and 5 meters tall, armed with 4 autocannons firing armor-piercing rounds and 2 missile launchers along the underside of the spacecraft. She's powered by 2 engines mounted in the rear and multiple navigational thrusters all over the craft to allow supreme mobility in space and 360-degree spin without losing speed or direction. After the checks were done and her crew chief agreed with her assessment, it was ready for combat. After settling into the cockpit, she began the check of the instruments, sensors, AUD, oxygen hookups to her flight suit, and alignment of the sensors in her helmet. She signaled her readiness, and the ground crew loaded her bird into one of Revenge's 120 launch tubes. She was a little nervous. This wasn't her first taste of space combat, but none of the other fights were this big. As her flight's youngest pilot, she was in the last launch tube to the right of her flight's element leader. She jumped slightly when the command came over her headset.
Eco Squadron launch.
The acceleration pushed her against the seatback as she rocketed down the tube. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw the bright flare from hundreds of other fighters exiting the ship. The voice of her flight leader came over their flight's TAC channel.
Form up on me and let's get this party started.
Lieutenant Tazi took her position to the right and slightly behind her element leader, who was in a similar position to the flight leader. She didn't recognize the voice that came over the squadron TACnet.
Mother of God!
But she agreed with it. The space before her was filled with thousands of rocket flares of missiles and torpedoes. Railgun rounds, only visible because of a special coating that acted like the tracers of old, were so thick it looked like you could walk on them. Pulses of plasma and laser fire crisscrossed the region between the two fleets. Enemy fighters rose from the ranks of Wraith warships, and coalition fighters and bombers rushed to greet them. A vast dance of death began as the Wraith fighters met the coalition fighters in the spaces between, and the waves of destruction the larger ships threw at each other. Here and there, an unlucky fighter or bomber ended up in the line of fire from the behemoths and briefly lit up a small piece of space as it exploded. She tried her best to stay with her element leader as he got on the tail of a Wraith fighter. His autocannon slugs took huge chunks from the enemy fighter before it exploded in a brilliant flash. And off they went, looking for another target in the massive sphere of dogfighting ships. Coalition fighters were better built and had better tech, but the Wraith fighters were damn fast, maneuverable, and so damn many of them. For every one that killed, 3 more seemed to take its place. Yaram felt a shudder in her ship and automatically scanned her screens. Her armor had held with no significant damage. She had a Wraith fighter on her tail doing its best to kill her. She fired her port thrusters, and her ship flipped 180 degrees. She squeezed the trigger and watched the slugs punch holes through the enemy cockpit, the enemy fighter losing control and zipping by her. She flipped again and went looking for her wingman. She spotted him just in time to see his ship disintegrate after being unlucky enough to be in the path of a plasma bolt meant for an opposing capital ship. She started to look for her flight leader when the group leader's voice came over the TAC net.
Echo Squadron, support bomber squadrons 3 and 6. Attack runs on enemy capital ships at grid X-ray 25. I repeat, X-ray 25. Suppress all enemy point defense weapons while the bombers make their runs.
She located the correct grid and headed that way. She passed the bombers on her way to attack the nearest cruiser, putting out AA fire. She skimmed only a few meters above the cruiser's hull, pouring fire into any weapon systems in her way, and then turned around to do it along the other side of the cruiser. One down, but so many more to go. Her squadron swarmed over the closest cruisers and capital ships, reducing the volume of fire but not ending it completely. They did their best, but several bombers were hit while doing their run. The others bored in on their targets, released their bombs, and quickly hightailed back to their carriers for rearmament. Yaram watched as the bombs hit their targets, but instead of exploding, they released a sticky molecular acid to eat through the hull. Yaram returned to the Revenge after seeing how low her fuel and ammunition were. There was wreckage everywhere, chunks of metal and bodies hanging in space. She landed in the assigned hangar and waited for the ground crew to get her out of the cockpit. She ordered more fuel and ammo restocked before taking care of personal business and then reporting to the CAG. She made her report and was given her new orders. While not as massive as the human motherships, the enemy flagship was still twice the size of Wraith capital ships. Despite heavy damage, it was still operational and extremely dangerous. Its main batteries were devastating coalition capital ships and damaging the mothership. So the admiral elected to send 100 heavily armed Marines to board it and destroy it from the inside. She was to join a dozen other fighters and escort the breaching pods against the Wraith flagship. After launching, Yaram linked up with the 4 breaching pods and their escorts. Navigating the gap between the forces had become more complicated with all the wreckage from Wraith and Coalition ships floating around. But it also gave the little convoy some cover until they were almost to the flagship. As soon as they left the debris field, the fighters accelerated and began suppressing enemy defense batteries in the breaching pod's path. Yaram was so intent on watching the pod attached to the flagship's hull and begin boarding procedures that she never knew the Wraith fighter was there. A half-dozen shots blew holes in her ship. She had just a moment to berate herself and then felt a moment of pain before her fighter exploded and became another piece of flotsam on the battlefield. Humans Are a Myth, Part 3.2. Planetside events during the final battle in Part 3. Poor, bloody infantry. Lance Corporal Harker looked at his watch again. Only 1 minute after the last time he checked. He always did this before combat. Check the watch, the rifle, the watch, and the rifle. He looked up and saw Kaglo laughing at his pre-combat routine. Kaglo was his Dolvad battle buddy. They'd been fighting together for months and were the only ones left of their original platoon. They'd been through a lot of shit together these last 9 months. Bexar 12, Regula 2, Drexia Prime, and that absolute nightmare battle for the Jexian colony on the 3rd moon of Lorena II. Coalition forces suffered 95% casualties by the time the last of those damn Wraiths were down. The ground pounders took 85% of those casualties from the ground combat, which made Harker wake up in a cold sweat on the bad nights. The Jexian factories let the Wraith pump out weapons by the thousands. And even worse, half of those damn factories were underground. They couldn't be wrecked from space or by air support. So it was up to the infantry to root them out with rifles, grenades, swords, and bayonets. The poor, bloody infantry, PBIs, as they referred to themselves, carried the day, but the cost was high. Entire companies were wiped out. The 4324th was massacred when they assaulted a factory complex under the capital city. 12,000 troopers went in and none came out. Alive anyways. It took the ghouls, grave registration, 2 weeks to connect all the remains from the tunnels and buildings, and another 6 months to collect and identify everything they had. The Wraith tore them apart, literally. The close quarters meant they were practically on top of you before you even realized that. The 43 on 25th gave as good as they got, though. They only left a couple thousand of the estimated 25K Wraith they engaged. That was the battle that wiped out their platoon and left just Kaglo and himself as uninjured survivors. Harker rechecked his watch, looked at the Dulvad, and signaled 5 minutes to go. They double-checked each other's gear, especially the jump packs. It was a long way down if it failed. It was time. Harker gave Kaglo a fist bump and then checked to ensure the rest of his fire team was ready. The back of the dropship opened, and Harker and Kaglo stepped to the edge. The light turned green, and they leapt into the air. The rest of his squad followed them. 2 more sticks came after. Harker enjoyed the sensation of free fall that came before activating the jump pack. Go too early, and you were an easy target for the Wraiths. Wait too long, and you can mess yourself up from the sudden change in direction. Harker fired the jets and landed safely. The rest of his men did as well, but someone from the other sticks messed up and came down like a stone. He landed with a scream and a thud. Harker ran over to check, even if he knew the trooper didn't survive. They'd landed on their head, so at least it was quick. He jogged over to join his sergeant and lieutenant to get his orders. SOP was for the first units to secure the landing zone. His squad was ordered to sweep and clear the closest buildings and then set up an OP. He'd get a pair of heavy weapon teams once the objective was secured. They used the tried-and-true infantry tactic as they approached the 3-story buildings. Kaglo rushed his fire team forward 10 meters, while Harker's team covered them. And then Kaglo's went to ground to provide cover as Harker's group rushed past them and dropped at 10 meters. They did this to the buildings. One team moved while the other covered them. It was slow progress, but safer with a possible strong point ahead. Upon reaching the buildings, they began to sweep them, but found nothing. Even the thermals showed it was clear. Harker had his team take up defensive positions, while he sent a runner to notify command the building was secure. While they waited, they began to improve the fortifications with materials taken from another nearby building. Squad-level railguns covered the front with interlocking fields of fire, mortar pits were dug behind the buildings, and walls around windows were strengthened with sandbags and extra layers of material. 45 minutes later, other units had moved up and secured a perimeter around what was now the command post, and Cole Flagg gave a briefing on the next stage of the operation. Beside her was a Rossi, dressed in rags and covered in bruises and scars. Cole Flagg began.
Word's come down that all drop troops made their LZs and were good to go with the next stage.
She moved aside to show a map of the city on the wall. Objectives were marked on it as known locations of enemy troops. The colonel gestured to the Rossi.
This is Jaleka, and he's been here for 7 years now. According to him, there are many other slaves that live inside the cities. He's also told us the Wraiths are there in force and have been preparing for the invasion for weeks now.
Cole Flagg continued.
Our orders are to drive the Wraith out of the city, minimize civilian casualties, and secure it. This won't be easy. Mechs, artillery, TATs, and even air support are of extremely limited use in this environment. It's a ship job, but the Admiral knows who to call for that. The poor, bloody infantry,
shouted the troopers, taking a sort of pride in getting the dirtiest and nastiest jobs to do, and doing it or die trying.
Dismissed,
she said, returning the soldier's salute. It had been 3 hours since they began the assault, and they were barely a block in. All hell had broken loose when coalition troopers entered the city. LCPL Harker and his squad were engaged in a firefight with a group of Wraith in a 4-story building ahead of them. Harker was trying to make himself as small a target as possible while trying to pinpoint that damn pulse laser emplacement. Miller's squad had been caught in the open when it fired on them. He had to leave 7 dead when he pulled out, so now it was Harker's job to take it out. He'd sent Caglo and his fire team into a nearby building to clear it and then distract the gunners until Harker's team could cross the open ground and assault the building. But he still wasn't sure which floor the damn thing was on. A fusillade of coalition projectiles struck several possible locations for the gun. Fuck it. Harker thought before he ran across the street, stooped as low as he could and still run in his armor. He took cover in the doorway while waiting for his team to cross.
So far, so good,
he said to himself. The last of his troopers went down as the pulse laser finally announced itself. Shit, he thought, and then gave orders to his team. They split into pairs and slowly advanced down the hallway, checking each room before moving on. They did this room by room, floor by floor, before finally locating the gun. He listened but couldn't tell how many Wraith were in there. Harker sent 2 troopers to the room directly below them. Once they were in place, Harker's team kicked in the door and fired into the room. The Wraith gunners were caught by surprise but reacted quickly and dove to the floor. The second they hit the floor, a volley of shots pierced the floor from below, shredding the prone Wraith. After determining they were the only ones in the room, he crossed to the window and gave the signal that it was done. He tossed the pulse laser out of the window and had the satisfaction of seeing it break into pieces. The Wraith wouldn't recover that weapon. They finished clearing the building, met up with Caglo's team, and went stalking the next strong point. As they crept along the wall of the next building, Harker reminded himself it could be worse. The Geis were fighting below ground in the tunnels and sewers. A sound from behind a door almost earned a grenade through the window before realizing they were civilians. But before they went, one of them pointed out another Wraith strong point. For 3 long days, the coalition forces fought a vicious close-quarters battle with the Wraith defenders. This allowed the Wraith to use their natural abilities to their fullest, and casualty lists showed that. The coalition took more casualties from the puncture wounds of claws, talons, and fangs than weapons fire. Wraith claws, talons, and teeth met coalition bayonets, swords, and other melee weapons. Coalition rifles became secondary to human shotguns and various pistols in the tight confines of urban combat. Block by block, street by street, building by building, floor by floor, and room by room, they battled the stubborn enemy. The Wraith used the lessons learned during years of combat with coalition forces, and they learned them well. Companies went in and came back as a platoon. Dead and wounded were brought out by the suicidally brave medics. Numerous lives were saved because they were willing to go right to the front line and retrieve the wounded. For 3 days the fighting raged until the Wraith finally had nowhere to fall back to. They took over a large factory located near the city center and wanted to make the coalition pay the butcher's bill to drive them out. But that wasn't needed. Thermals and other devices determined there were only Wraith inside, so Command called in a bombardment from orbit. Once that was done, the infantry rushed the ruins and finished off any survivors before they could recover. 1 city down, dozens to go. LCPL Harker sat with his helmet off and his back to a wall. His helmet, armor, and weapons were covered in the gore from several species. He looked towards Caglo, but he wasn't there anymore. He got jumped by 3 Wraiths and managed to kill 2 before the 3rd brought him down. Harker killed the 3rd and then wept as his friend died in his arms. Only 5 members of his squad were still hale. The rest were dead, wounded, or missing. He tried to take solace in the low number of civilian casualties, but it was hard to remember that after his closest friend, his battle buddy, and his brother had joined thousands of others in death. Right now he just wanted out of this armor, some hot food, a shower, and some sleep. Not necessarily in that order. He knew this wasn't done. There were more cities and camps to liberate before it was done. But humanity's final revenge was almost here. Humans Are a Myth, Part 4. Admiral Tanaka surveyed the wreckage of thousands of ships from both sides of the battle. As he watched, rescue ships were scouring the wreckage for survivors. Thousands of capital ships floated dead in space, their hulls cracked open or holed from the barrages thrown at both sides. Many smaller craft were hardly more than a cloud of debris, the frozen bodies of their pilots nearby. The fighting in space was over. The destruction of the enemy flagship threw the Wraith into complete disarray. Any form of organized resistance fell apart and left the Wraith ships easy pickings for the Coalition fleet. The battle on the surface still raged, but Coalition ground forces, assisted by hundreds of thousands of slaves rising against their oppressors, had Wraith ground forces reeling. Coalition warships assisted with the orbital bombing of marked targets. The death throes of the Wraith's once vast empire consumed the lives of millions on both sides, but the campaign was finally over. Admiral Tanaka thought to himself, the long campaign of revenge was over. It was time to rebuild the human race. Kolvak was sound asleep when the chirp of the communicator woke him. This better be good. He muttered to himself and was surprised to see the Kexian ambassador to the Great Council.
I'm sorry to disturb your rest, Elder Kolvak, but a matter has come up, and your assistance would be greatly appreciated.
Kolvak listened in stunned silence as the ambassador explained the situation to him. When he had finished, Kolvak finally spoke.
Of course I will dress and meet you in the capital chambers.
All across the territory that made up the Grand Council, a single phrase was broadcast on every channel and every screen. It appeared in both Galactic Common and the native languages. It simply said,
"We are coming."
This is repeated every day in the Grand Council's chambers just after the session was opened. The council members became more agitated by the day. Was a new enemy announcing their arrival? What did it mean? On the 9th day, another message went out on every channel.
"We are here."
The Grand Council received another message.
"Tomorrow is Judgment Day."
This phrase sent the council into an uproar. Calls of distress, fear, and fury rang out in the halls in hundreds of voices. Everyone was so agitated that none noticed the handful of delegations that simply sat and watched with their equivalent of little smiles on their faces. Even the normally Dor-Baratsines seemed highly amused at the chaos. It had been many cycles since Kolvak had been in the Grand Council chambers, but he wouldn't miss this for anything. He never thought he'd set foot in these chambers again. He took his seat in the Kexian delegation's designated area and looked around at the various delegations, seeing the look of fear and worry on their faces. He nodded to the few beings that weren't acting in the same way. Garnick, the long-serving council speaker, brought the noise to a hush with a single tap of the bell-like device on the podium. He spoke the ritual opening.
This convocation has now begun. Let all speak as equals and maintain the bonds of peace while inside these hallowed halls.
Before Garnick could say another word, Korkan spoke up.
Council Speaker, if I may?
Garnick seemed annoyed by the breach of protocol, but saw no reason to object.
The speaker recognizes the Kexian ambassador.
Korkan walked to the center of the chamber.
I ask permission for a guest to address this august body.
The last said with a subtle mockery most of the ambassadors missed. A voice shouted from the upper rows,
"Why should we waste our time with this when there is an important matter to discuss?"
Korkan faced the direction the question came from.
Tut tut, Ambassador Zanara, you know the rules. Until my request is approved or denied, no other comments may be made.
Garnick rumbled his agreement and then followed up with,
Does any ambassador second this motion?
Seconded,
came the reply from a half-dozen ambassadors. Korkan looked at the speaker, his eyes asking the question. Garnick simply said,
Proceed.
Korkan once again addressed the assembly.
Honored ambassadors, dignitaries, and guests. For the last several days, we've received a series of cryptic messages, and we've worried and wondered about them.
With a dramatic pause before continuing.
The last one indicated today to be Judgment Day. My guest will enlighten us today about the meanings of those messages.
With that, he stepped back and indicated the center of the floor with a wave of his arm. There was a slight shimmering, and a being in armor seemed to appear from nowhere. The helmet's faceplate was opaque and gave no hint of the occupant. All they could tell was that they had one head and two arms and were bipedal. The being reached a hand over to press something on the wrist of the other arm. The armor retracted into several parts of the uniform worn by the strange being. A few astonished gasps erupted from the oldest members of the assembly. Even Garnick was shocked.
It can't be,
he exclaimed. The being stepped forward.
I am President Matilda Becker of the New Terran Republic and head of the Andromedan Coalition.
She looked at the various members of the assembly.
The humans have returned to the galaxy of our birth.
She paused at the uproar her words elicited and waited until it died down.
50 human years ago, the Wraith, as we call them, attacked members of this Grand Council.
Scorn filled her voice as she used the title.
We called for war against them to support the weaker races they attacked. This council talked and did nothing. Only 7 governments stood at our side and drove the Wraith from this galaxy.
She began to pace as she talked.
And what was our reward?
She was angry as she answered her question.
We were betrayed by a member of this council, and our worlds were destroyed. Our home, our cradle world, and the rest of the Sol system were obliterated.
She reached under her uniform and pulled out some sort of tag on a chain around her neck.
This is what we still have of our worlds. Each human ID tag carries a piece of our destroyed worlds as a reminder of what we lost.
She stopped and faced a section of the chamber. Her voice turned menacing.
And a promise to deal with the ones who almost extinguished the spark of the human race. 5 human years ago, we repaid the Wraith for their destruction of our worlds and the genocide against our race. We made friends and allies in the Andromeda Galaxy, who had also suffered at their hands. We formed the Coalition and fought the Wraith across hundreds of worlds and vast expanses of space, until we stood on the doorstep of their home world. Millions of lives were lost in that final campaign before it was done. The Wraith's empire was liberated and the few surviving Wraith were exiled to a small moon. They will never be allowed to leave it.
She looked up as she spoke.
We learned many new things and found new technology to improve the lives of all the members of the Coalition. My armor is just a small part of those improvements.
She then looked directly at one delegation as she said,
And we learned who betrayed us.
The chamber once again broke out in a cacophony of noises from hundreds of sources. President Becker called out,
Ambassador Sin Amana of the Brath.
Looking directly at the Brath delegation.
Will you join me on the chamber's floor?
Every eye turned to look at the Brath ambassador. They all saw the same shimmer as before, and 4 humans were revealed to be standing behind them. The wild-eyed Brath looked for a way to escape, but the 4 humans prevented that. They picked him up and marched him to the floor. They weren't particularly cruel in their handling of the ambassador, but neither were they respectful of his position. Once the ambassador was brought before her, the Terran president nodded to her troopers, and they released the ambassador, who immediately slumped to the floor. President Becker towered over the Brath ambassador.
Sin Amana of the Brath, your people stand accused of providing information to the Wraith that led to the destruction of hundreds of human colonies and billions of human lives.
Sin Amana looked up and pleaded.
I wasn't even born when this happened. I'm innocent.
True, but it was the Brath government that did, and you are a member of that government.
She said, her voice thick with anger. She took a round device from a pouch on her belt and tossed it on the floor. It projected a huge 3D image of a planet.
Do you recognize this world, Ambassador?
She asked.
It's Brath.
He replied. The image changed to a security feed from one of the Brath warships in orbit.
Do you recognize the Brothy at the bridge of this cruiser?
It's my son. Please don't hurt him.
He begged. She pushed another button.
Speak to him.
The ambassador looked confused.
How?
She indicated the image. It was obvious something was happening on the ship as techs furiously worked on their consoles, and his son was visibly confused.
Bardra, it is your father.
He tentatively spoke, not believing it would work. The image of his son started looking around for the source before replying.
Father? Where are you?
I am in the Grand Council chambers.
The president cut the ambassador off.
Tell him something is going to happen and to not do anything stupid.
Chinnamana spoke to his son and relayed the message. She nodded at one of the guards, and from behind the helmet, a voice simply said,
Now.
The image split to show the planet and the cruiser's bridge at the same time. Hundreds and then thousands of specks of lights appeared above the globe, and some were seen through the cruiser's view screen. Each speck grew until it flashed, and in its place was a ship. Thousands of ships were suddenly there. You could see the startled look on Cinnamana's son as this happened. He was just starting to give some orders when the president opened the link again.
Tell him to stop what he is doing and radio their fleet to stand down.
Despite his misgivings, the ambassador passed the message on and convinced his son to give the orders.
Excellent, Ambassador. You are doing great.
President Becker said, with a hint of condescension in her voice. She turned to address the assembly.
Esteemed ambassadors, I wish to introduce you to a small portion of the Coalition's war fleet.
She paused for dramatic effect before continuing.
They just jumped in directly from Andromeda.
At this pronouncement, the chambers erupted into shouts and insults, calling her a liar and worse. She held up her hand for quiet, but it took Speaker Garnick practically smashing the bell-like device to quiet them down.
I say this not to brag, but as a warning. Calling in reinforcements would be a very bad idea.
She began to walk around the floor again, focusing their attention on her movements.
As for those that called me a liar, I would ask some friends to verify the claim.
She dramatically swept her arm towards the delegations of her longtime friends and allies.
Before revealing ourselves for this session, we made contact with our old allies from the fight against the Wraith.
She smiled warmly at the Kexian delegation, whose ties with humanity ran very deep.
And representatives of their governments were invited to visit our new home world and also testify to our ability to travel with such speed.
She looked around the chambers before saying,
My friends, if you would be so kind as to verify my claims.
With that, the delegations from the Kexian, Kithranka, Berethians, Zathrex, Galians, Malakitsan, and Xrexians stood up and confirmed the humans' claim. While some might have been willing to call out the smaller races as being puppets of the humans, no one would ever call out the Kithranka as liars. They'd been known to rip off the offenders' appendages and beat them to death with it. Part of joining the Grand Council, as a new ambassador, was being specifically warned about it and watching the footage of a massive Shulkor learning that lesson the hard way. Despite being twice his size, the Kithrankan ambassador ripped off the Shulkor ambassador's tail and nearly killed him with it. Only its vast size and pleading from the speaker kept it from dying.
Now where were we?
She said, tapping her finger against her chin as if she was thinking. It was obvious to Kovvak that she was enjoying herself immensely.
Our betrayal at the hands of the Brath.
Staring directly at the ambassador, she looked at one of her guards, an unspoken question passing between them. At his nod, She turned to the globe and changed the image. It showed a large room, decorated with priceless gems and metals.
Ambassador Keen Amana, do you recognize this room?
She asked. He tore his eyes away from her predatory gaze with a distinct effort.
It's the Brothy throne room,
he replied, confusion and fear showing on his face. President Becker nodded to her aide again, who gave a barely audible command over his comms.
Now.
The view changed as the camera turned to show dozens of Brothy on their knees, human soldiers standing behind them. The camera then panned to the left and showed a Brothy male, gowned in bejeweled robes, kneeling before a pair of humans. Ambassador Sinamana was shocked, but numbly answered when the president ordered him to confirm his identity.
That is Emperor Cartharax IV of the Brothy Empire.
He turned to look at the human president again.
But how? The throne room is the most secure place in the Empire.
President Becker merely winked and replied,
Trade secret.
She looked around the chamber and raised her voice.
Does anyone dispute that our actions are permitted under Grand Council law?
No one objected, she continued.
In light of their actions assisting the Wraith in their genocidal actions against my people, does anyone contest our right to deal out justice in any manner we chose aside from total annihilation of the Brock?
Once again, the chamber remained silent. The president glanced at her aide and nodded. He gave another barely audible command, and one of the humans guarded the emperor prodded him with his boot.
Can you hear me, Your Majesty?
She asked. The kneeling figure just nodded.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you,
she said.
Yes, I can hear you.
The emperor replied, his voice and demeanor submissive.
Good. I want you to hear my proclamation of our actions in obtaining justice for you for enabling such a horrible crime against humanity at the same time as this assembly.
She took another dramatic pause before continuing.
The order to relay the location of our worlds came directly from Emperor Catharax III. His death put him beyond our reach, but we do have you, Emperor.
She looked out at the assembly before continuing.
You will abdicate your throne immediately. The monarchy is dissolved, and you will be our guest on New Terra.
She turned to the Brothy ambassador.
Kinamana, you will help organize a new government for your people. I don't care which form it takes, but choose one to benefit your people.
Chinamana nodded before speaking.
What are the other terms?
Your empire took several colonies by aggressive actions against weaker races. You will give them back. How you do it to be decided by negotiations with the respective races.
Chinamana looked crestfallen.
I understand.
His reply was barely audible.
And what happens to my people?
The president smiled and simply said,
Nothing.
Chinamana's head jerked up, thinking he misheard her.
Nothing? Your people are innocent, and we do not hold the actions of others against the innocent,
she answered. She directed her last remark to the rest of the Grand Council.
But keep in mind, while we might forgive, we do not forget.